everybody, this is Ebony Love, and I'm back with part 2 of the series in how to mark your dies. In the first video, I showed you how to mark your strip cutters and which tools you needed in order to effectively mark your dies. In this video, I'm going to show you how to mark geometric shapes. This applies to both your studio and die cutters, so I have a mixture of dies from both the studio that I'd like to show you. The first die is the value die from the Go, and this is just to show you how you want to mark multiple shapes on your die. This particular die has 3 different shapes on it, a 2.5-inch square, a 4.5-inch square, and then 2-inch finished triangles laid up in a multiple format. So the very first thing whenever I get a die or I'm about to use a die, is I mark the die shape on the die itself. So I try to get my Sharpie marker inserted in between the foam and draw along the die. So hopefully you can see that. You just insert the edge of the tip of the Sharpie and drag it along the die blade. This does tend to shred up the Sharpie markers, as you can imagine, so I do keep a number of them on hand. Once you have drawn all of the die blades, and this is also helpful so you know where to place your finger so you're not cutting yourself or potentially cutting yourself on the dies themselves, then I also draw alignment marks for each of the shapes. And these alignment marks are so that I align the straight grain with the blades itself, not with the die, but the actual blades. And the second reason for drawing these lines is so that I know that I have enough fabric to cover a particular shape. I give myself about a 1/4 inch of wiggle room for these shapes. So when I draw my lines to align the shapes, I draw them 1/4 inch away from the edge of the die. So as an example, for this multi-shape die, for the triangles, I've drawn a line 1/4 inch away from the edge of the blade. So to do that, I would just take my acrylic ruler and I would align the 1/4 inch line on my ruler with the blade itself. When you're working with smaller dies, you may want to use a smaller ruler. I like to just, this ruler is just always on my cutting table, so I tend to just use this one. So as you look at this with the marker, you want to align that with the edge of the blade itself and draw your line. I also draw a line on at least one other side. Typically, I will draw these lines on all 4 sides of the shape so that no matter how I'm cutting, which direction I'm cutting, I can always get alignment and make sure that it's square. So for this one, I just chose to draw a line on the outside of this shape here. So what this does is it allows me to align the straight grain of my fabric going this way. So you can imagine if I had a strip of fabric, I would lay the fold along this edge with the rest of the strip extending this way, and that would enable me to cut the full width of the shape. Sometimes what I do too is right on the die itself, I will look at the die or measure the die in some cases and figure out what size strip would cover the die. So in this case, because it's a 2.5-inch triangle, and I give myself a 1/4 inch of wiggle room, that's going to give me a 3-inch strip. So I can just write the 3 inches right on top of the foam. This doesn't hurt the foam or impact your shapes at all. It's just a handy reference. And I know that when these dies are packed, AccuQuilt does give you, for the Go in particular, it does give you a sheet that tells you what size strips you need to cut. I find that those recommendations are pretty generous, so if you want to maximize your cuts, you should measure your dies and make sure that you give yourself the wiggle room that you feel comfortable with. I do the same thing with the squares. Again, these shapes are sometimes angled in the dies. You want the straight of grain to follow the line of the die and not the board that the die is sitting in. Another shape, so that's one set of geometric shapes with multiple ups. This is an example of a triangle shape. This is a studio die, so again using my silver Sharpie. And with this particular shape, I draw a straight line across the bottom, again 1/4 inch down. But then when I mark the top, I actually draw the line right at the tip of the triangle. And I do this for a couple of purposes. One, because this this die is used, I use this for two purposes. One, to cut the triangles themselves, and then two, I also use them for aligning strips with the, to cut binding strips. So this helps me to cut the edges off, and I have a video on that if you want to show how to cut continuous binding strips using a triangle die for the studio. I also have a directional arrow here marked with an M, which is a mirror for me, and so this actually helps me with that extra shape. So again, just as I marked the size of the strip on the other die to kind of give me a hint as to what size strip will cover that die, I write this M with the arrow direction as a tip for when I'm using this die for other purposes. Another handy tip for marking geometric shapes is that some geometric shapes are not symmetrical. And what that means for you is that when they're not symmetrical, you cannot lay your fabric down folded across the width of the fabric, because that's going to get you mirror images of the shapes. So it's actually fine when you're using solid fabrics where the color goes through exactly the same on both sides of the prints. It works for batiks in a lot of cases as well, but when you're cutting with printed fabric, which is typically printed on one side of the fabric, you don't want to use that for all types of shapes. So what I discovered for the flying triangle block in particular is that I needed to put all of the fabric facing one direction. So after I drew my alignment marks, I wrote on the end of the die that for the flying triangle block, the fabric is placed right side down. You could also do right side up, but for that particular block, right side down gets all the windmills going in the same direction. For another block, you might have a different shape. Another thing that you can do is mark on the back of the die. So sometimes you'll run out of room on the front of the die to write information. So on the back of the die, this is a studio die, I have written what size strips to cut and instructions for the flying triangle block. So as I learn about cutting more blocks, I can add additional information here. And this was done with a thin line Sharpie. You could do the same thing on the back of the Go dies. You'll probably need to use a thicker marker though. So those are the tips for marking the dies for geometric shapes. So stay tuned for part 3 where we'll cover applique shapes. Thank you.